Michael Carter had only stopped in for a cup of coffee. That was all. 1 cup, then home to Emma. He wasn't looking for trouble, he never was. But the moment he saw the waitress cornered against the counter, her arm caught in the grip of a man twice her size, her voice too quiet and too careful in the way a person sounds when they're trying not to make things worse, Michael set down his mug, pushed back his chair, and stood up. He didn't think about it. Some things don't require thinking. The woman with the plain apron and the tired eyes had no idea what was coming, and neither did he, because she wasn't just a waitress. She was the one person in that city with the power to change everything about his life, and the night he stood up for her would be the night the whole city learned his name. Stay until the end. What she has been hiding will make you question everything you just witnessed. Michael Carter was 38 years old, and he had the kind of face that came from working outdoors in all weather, windburned, honest, older than his years in the right way. He ran the service bay at a mid-sized auto repair shop on the eastern edge of Millbrook, a suburb that existed somewhere between scraping by and getting comfortable, depending on which block you were standing on. Michael's block was the scraping by kind. The houses on his street were the sort that needed something fixed at all times: a gutter, a window latch, a section of fence that leaned toward the road whenever the wind came in hard. He fixed things. That was what he did, and he was good at it, and for a long time it had been enough. He had lost his wife, Laura, 5 years ago, to an illness that moved faster than anyone expected. She was gone in 4 months. Their daughter, Emma, had been 2 years old at the time, young enough that her clearest memories of her mother now came from photographs rather than her own recollection. Michael understood that this was both a mercy and a grief he carried quietly, the way he carried most things. He did not speak about it at work. He did not speak about it much at home either. Though Emma was old enough now to ask questions, he answered as carefully and honestly as he could manage. Emma was 7 now, and she was the organizing principle of his entire existence. Every decision Michael made, the hours he worked, the overtime he accepted, the way he budgeted his money down to the last dollar pointed back to her, her school, her lunches, the way she laughed when she told him about her day, big and sudden, the way children laugh when something has genuinely surprised them. He had not taken a vacation in 3 years. He had canceled 2 weekend plans and 1 birthday dinner for himself in the same span. He did not complain about any of this. It was simply the shape of his life, and the shape was right. He had a dream. Still, not a loud dream, more the kind you keep in a back room and check on sometimes, making sure it hasn't gone cold. He wanted to open his own garage. Something small, just his name on the sign, and a few bays he could manage himself, with the freedom to take the jobs he wanted and turn down the ones that smelled like trouble. He'd had the business plan sketched out on paper for 2 years before he stopped updating it. The numbers never worked. Too much upfront capital, not enough credit history for a commercial loan, and not enough savings left after rent and food and Emma's school supplies to make the gap anything but discouraging. So the paper sat in a drawer, and Michael went back to fixing other men's cars, and the dream waited with the patience of something that has nowhere else to go. Most evenings after the last job, he stopped at Rosie's Diner on Clement Avenue, a small, deliberately ordinary place, with booths that had been reupholstered twice, and a counter that smelled like old coffee and something faintly sweet. He wasn't a social man, but the quiet of the place suited him, and the staff knew his order without asking. He sat, he ate, he read the news on his phone, and then he went home to Emma. He never stayed long. He never needed to. That was his life, and for 5 years, it had been enough. The new waitress had been at Rosie's for about 3 weeks when Michael first noticed her. She was listed on the schedule as Jessica Miller, and if you looked at her, the practical ponytail, the worn sneakers, the way she carried the coffee pot with both hands, because the handle was slightly loose, she looked exactly like someone who needed the work and was willing to do it. But Michael noticed, over 2 or 3 visits, that something didn't quite fit. Not in a troubling way, just in the way a piece of furniture is slightly wrong for a room everything accounted for. Nothing technically out of place, and yet she moved too deliberately. When a customer asked her a question about the menu, She thought before she answered not to remember the items, but as if she was deciding how much information to offer. Her handwriting on the order pad was tight and precise. Once, when the owner's ancient cash register jammed, she watched him wrestle with it for a full minute, and then said quietly, "The drawer catch is stuck on the left side if you press the bottom panel while you pull," and it opened. The owner looked at her strangely. She went back to wiping down the counter without another word. Nobody asked where she came from. At a place like Rosie's, that wasn't how things worked. You showed up, you did the work, you got paid. Jessica Miller showed up and did the work. It was a Thursday evening in early November when it happened. Michael had come in later than usual, around 9. The diner was unusually crowded for a weeknight. A college football game was playing on the mounted television in the corner, and the booth near the back had been occupied for 2 hours by a group of 3 men who had been drinking long before they arrived. They were loud in the loose, escalating way that had nothing to do with happiness, the kind of loud that searches for a target. Jessica was their waitress. Michael watched it from across the room, the way you watch a weather system move in from a distance and know with a certainty that has nothing to do with hope that it is going to arrive. First it was comments, nothing she could refuse outright without creating a scene. Then it was requests that kept her at their table longer than necessary. One of the men began angling himself so that she had to lean around him to set down the plates, and each time she did, he moved just slightly closer. She kept her expression neutral, and her voice professionally even. She was managing it, carefully and with obvious experience, but her eyes were scanning the room in a way that told him she was looking for an exit or an ally. Neither presented itself. Tommy Briggs, who owned Rosie's, was stationed behind the counter with his arms crossed and his attention rigidly fixed on the television. The other waitress on duty had found reasons to stay in the kitchen. 3 other customers in the diner looked at their phones or their plates with a focused intensity that required no peripheral vision whatsoever. The room was performing the collective act of not noticing, which is one of the things a room full of people does best when what they are not noticing involves confrontation and consequences. When one of the men reached out and caught Jessica's wrist as she turned to leave the table, Michael was already getting up. He didn't rehearse what he was going to say. He crossed the room in 8 or 9 steps and stopped beside their booth. "Let go of her arm," he said. His voice was level, not loud, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to be heard. The man who had grabbed her thick through the shoulders, with a red face and the confidence of someone who had not encountered consequences, recently looked up at Michael with genuine amusement. "Relax, hero. We're just having a conversation." "She's done having it," Michael said. The man released her wrist, but slowly and deliberately, the kind of release designed to communicate that it was a choice and not a concession. Jessica took a half step back. Michael didn't move. "Walk away, buddy," said one of the others, "before you embarrass yourself." Michael said nothing. He was looking at the first man with an expression that was not aggressive, but was very, very patient in a way that communicated exactly how little he was going to be moved. What happened next was fast. The second man, shorter, with a wiry build and the kind of energy that goes wrong, quickly shoved Michael in the chest with both hands. Michael staggered back 1 step, kept his balance, and when the same man came forward again, Michael caught him by the arm and turned him, efficiently and without excess force, so that he was facing the booth rather than the room. He didn't hit anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He held the situation the way you hold a tool you know how to use, firmly, without drama, until it was under control. There was a brief, gasping silence in the diner. The first man stood up slowly, his eyes on Michael, recalculating something. The third man put a hand on his arm. Gradually, incrementally, the energy in the booth shifted from threat to retreat. It was not spectacular. It was just over. Enough. The word came from behind the counter. Tommy Briggs had his phone in his hand, though whether he had called anyone was unclear. He was looking at Michael, not at the men who had started it. "You, out. Right now." Michael looked at him for a moment. "These men, I don't care. You're the one causing a scene in my place. Get out." Michael looked at Jessica. She was standing very still, her arms at her sides, watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not fear, exactly. Something more considered than fear. He picked up his jacket from the stool where he'd left it and walked out. She caught up with him in the parking lot. He was standing by his truck, keys in his hand, the cold air doing what it always did when he was frustrated, clearing his head before he made anything worse. He heard the door behind him and turned. Jessica had her apron in her hands, folded once, the way you fold something when you're not sure whether you're finished with it yet. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "You don't have to," he answered. "I know I don't have to, but I wanted to." He nodded. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable. "Nobody in there moved," he said finally. Not as an accusation, just the thing he was thinking. "No," she agreed, "they didn't." "You were handling it," he said. "I was managing it," she said. And there was a precise, small difference in the way she said those two words that he noticed but didn't comment on. He studied her for a moment longer than he intended. She spoke carefully, like someone who chose each word deliberately. Her vocabulary was wider than her uniform suggested. He assumed, in the way that people do, that she had probably studied something once and things had not gone the way she planned. It was a familiar story in Millbrook. He didn't ask. "It shouldn't have happened," he said. "No," she said. "It shouldn't have." The cold came in off the street between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she tucked the apron under her arm and turned back toward the diner without another word. And he stood there for another few seconds before he got in the truck. He drove home. Emma was asleep. He sat for a while in the kitchen with the lights low, thinking about nothing in particular, and found that he couldn't quite stop. The next morning, Jessica Miller was fired. Tommy Briggs called it a disturbance she had encouraged. That was the word he used, encouraged. He said she had provoked the situation and that his customers had been upset by the scene. He gave her $40 in cash and asked her to return her uniform by Friday. She walked out of Rosie's with her bag over her shoulder and stood on Clement Avenue in the thin November light, working through the implications with the methodical calm of someone who had navigated worse reversals than this, and had learned that the most useful thing to do after an unfair outcome is to decide what comes next. Michael heard about it 2 days later through the woman who worked the morning shift and occasionally brought her car to his shop for oil changes. He felt the low, familiar irritation of watching something unjust happen without remedy. On Friday afternoon, he drove down Clement Avenue, saw Jessica sitting on the low wall outside the diner with a paper coffee cup, and stopped. "You need work?" he asked, through the truck window. She looked at him steadily. "Yes, I've got a front desk. Phones, paperwork, intake forms. It's not glamorous." "I'll take it," she said. She started the following Monday. The garage was a converted gas station with 3 bays, a small front office, and a waiting area with 2 chairs and a folding table covered in automotive magazines 3 years out of date. She answered phones, wrote up repair orders, filed invoices, and kept track of the parts supplier schedule, which had been managed with a paper system held together entirely by habit and optimism. By the end of her first week, she had converted it to a spreadsheet that pulled from the supplier's online catalog and automatically flagged delays before they became problems. Michael looked at it and didn't say anything for a moment. "How did you—" "The system was losing you about 4 hours a week," she said simply. "This should help." He went back to the bay and did not ask further questions, because the work was good, and he had learned not to question good work when it arrived. But he watched her, not with suspicion, with the quiet attention of someone trying to understand something that doesn't add up cleanly. Once, when a customer came in upset about an invoice he claimed was too high, Jessica walked him through the breakdown line by line, in a tone of such calm and thorough authority that the man left not only satisfied, but apologetic. He shook her hand on the way out. Michael stood in the doorway of the bay afterward, grease on his forearms, looking at the empty waiting room for a moment before he went back to work. He was beginning to understand that whatever Jessica Miller was, she was not simply someone who had needed a front desk job in Millbrook, but understanding that and knowing what to do with it were 2 different things, and he had learned a long time ago not to ask questions that might cost him a good answer. The strange moments were small, but accumulated. She received calls she always stepped outside to take, keeping her voice too low to hear. Twice a dark sedan had parked briefly across the street, in the patient way of someone conducting surveillance or waiting for a decision to be made. Once, while helping Emma with a drawing at the front desk after school, her phone buzzed, and something moved quickly across her face and was gone before it had fully arrived. She set the phone face down and picked up the crayon Emma had handed her and said, "What color do you want the sky?" Emma, who was an excellent judge of character in the intuitive way of children, had decided within 48 hours of meeting Jessica that she was a good person. She showed her drawings. She told her about her teacher, about the girl in her class who was sometimes mean and sometimes not, about the book they were reading and why the ending was wrong. Jessica engaged with all of it, with a seriousness that Emma recognized as respect, the thing children feel most clearly when it is genuinely being offered to them by an adult who has decided they are worth taking seriously. Michael saw this and said nothing, but something in him that had been quietly taught for a long time began, almost without his permission, to loosen. The man arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Jessica had started. He came through the front door of the garage in a dark wool suit that was wrong for the neighborhood in every possible way. Too well cut, too clearly expensive, the kind of suit that doesn't appear in auto repair waiting rooms. He stopped at the desk where Jessica was sitting and said her name in a low voice. Not the name on her name tag, a different name. She stood up immediately. Her posture changed not dramatically, but the way a person changes when they are suddenly standing in their professional role rather than a temporary one. They spoke near the door, not quite outside. Michael was under a sedan in Bay 2, and he stayed where he was, but he heard fragments. Enough. Phrases moved through the air with the clipped precision of people who have spoken this language so long they no longer need full sentences. Confirmed the internal discrepancy. 3 subsidiaries. The audit team is ready to move when you give the word. And then, quietly, but clearly, we have confirmed internal fraud across the restaurant division. The exposure is significant. Michael rolled out from under the car. By the time he stood up, the man was gone, and Jessica was at the desk again, her expression composed so carefully that it told him, without a word, that she was aware he had heard something and had already decided what to do about that. Their eyes met across the garage. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Everything's fine." She left early that day. The next morning she called to say she needed a few days. She was sorry for the short notice. She would explain when she returned. She did not answer her phone for 4 days. On the 3rd day, Michael found himself doing something he wouldn't have predicted. He was worried about her, not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, practical way of a person who has let someone into the edge of his life and now cannot account for them. Emma asked where Jessica was. She had some things to take care of, Michael said. "When is she coming back?" "I don't know, Bug." Emma accepted this, with the dissatisfied patience of a child who knows she is not getting the full answer and is saving the rest of the conversation for later. On the 4th evening, Michael was watching a local news program, while Emma ate cereal for dinner because neither of them had felt like cooking. There was a business segment, a brief piece about a corporate restructuring announcement at a company called Whitmore Group, one of the larger investment and hospitality conglomerates in the region. The camera cut to an exterior shot of a gleaming office tower downtown. Then, for approximately 4 seconds, a woman walked across the background behind the reporter. She was wearing a tailored charcoal jacket. Her hair was up. She carried herself with a precision that was entirely, unmistakably her own. Michael leaned forward. The segment moved on. He sat back slowly, his cereal going warm beside him. He told himself it was a coincidence. He told himself it was the distance, the bad angle, the television resolution. He told himself a number of things that did not, individually or collectively, add up to a complete argument. She came back on a Friday. The car that pulled up in front of the garage was a dark gray sedan, not the kind that parks briefly across the street, but the kind with a driver who gets out and opens the rear door. Jessica stepped out in a coat he had not seen before, charcoal wool, the same shade he had seen on television 4 days earlier. Her hair was different, not different in the way of a style change, but different in the way of a person who has put it back the way it belongs when they are being themselves. She looked like the same person, and also, undeniably, like an entirely different one. She stood in the door of the garage and waited until Michael's current customer had left. Then she said, "I owe you an explanation." He said nothing. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at her. She told him. Her name was Jessica Whitmore. She was 36 years old. For the past 9 years, she had served as CEO of the Whitmore Group Hospitality, Real Estate, Food Service, 1,500 employees across 11 states. 6 months ago, a mid-level analyst in her finance division had flagged anomalies in the restaurant subsidiary's labor reporting. What began as a line-item discrepancy had opened into something larger and uglier. A network of managers skimming wages, falsifying hours, intimidating hourly workers into silence, the kind of systemic exploitation that is almost invisible from a corner office because it was designed to be invisible from a corner office. She had decided to see it herself, not through auditors or investigators or carefully organized presentations. Herself. She had created a working identity, found a diner in a neighborhood where she was unlikely to be recognized, and gone in as a waitress. She had expected to last 2 weeks before someone connected the dots. She lasted a month. She found exactly what she was looking for, and in the middle of looking for it, a man had stood up and walked across a room for no reason, other than that someone needed him to. "You were the only person who moved," she said. Michael looked at his hands. He was quiet in the way people are quiet when they are being told something true. "You didn't know who I was. You had nothing to gain. You just..." She stopped. "I've spent 9 years watching people make decisions about me. What I want to hear, what I want them to do. Every favor has an accounting somewhere." She looked at him directly. "That's not what you did." He was quiet for a long time. A truck passed on the street outside and the sound of it came and went. "You should have told me," he said finally. "I know," she said. "When you took the job here." "I know. I didn't know I was going to stay that long," she said. And there was something in the way she said it that was not quite an excuse and not quite an apology, and was somehow more honest than either. He didn't ask what she meant by that. He filed it away the way he filed most things he wasn't ready to examine yet. He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else for a while. The garage filled with the ordinary sounds of traffic and a radio in Bay 1, and the distance between two people who have been honest with each other and are now working out what that means. 2 weeks later, a story broke in the regional business press about the Whitmore Group. It was not the internal fraud story that investigation had been turned over to auditors and would take months to fully surface. This was different. A leaked video clip, shot on a phone, showing a man in an altercation in a diner. The clip was 3 seconds long, poorly lit, and showed only the moment Michael had blocked the second man's second shove. By the time the story reached wider circulation, it had become a violent confrontation, staged to intimidate customers. Michael's phone began ringing the next morning. He did not answer. By noon, there were people parked outside the garage. He sent Emma to her aunt's house, locked the front office, and kept working because there were 3 cars that needed to be finished, and he was not a man who stopped working because the world became inconvenient. His 2 mechanics kept their heads down and said nothing, and he was grateful for that without saying so. Jessica called him at 2 in the afternoon. "I need you to not talk to anyone," she said. "I wasn't planning to. I'm going to handle this." "You don't have to, Michael." Her voice was careful and exact. "You didn't have to walk across that room, but you did. Let me do this." He was quiet. Then, "Okay," he said. She faced a genuine choice in the hours that followed. She could manage the situation quietly, allow the ambiguous clip to fade without comment, protect the company's fragile positioning while the fraud investigation progressed. It would have been the cautious decision, and professionally the safer one. It would have cost her nothing, and cost him everything. She held the press conference the following morning. Jessica Whitmore stood before cameras and stated clearly and without hedging that she had personally witnessed the incident in question, that the man in the video had intervened to stop the harassment of a female employee, that the framing of the incident as violent or inappropriate was false, and that she was releasing the full, unedited footage from Rosie's diner security cameras, which showed the complete sequence of events from the first moment the customer grabbed her arm. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not use notes. The full footage ran for most of the afternoon on every local news channel. It was very clear. Michael was in it for 2 minutes and 14 seconds, and in that time he said exactly what had been reported and did not do a single thing that required a second viewing to understand. By evening, the 3 men from the diner had been identified. 2 of them were employees of a vendor contracted to the Whitmore restaurant division. The vendor contract was terminated the following day. Tommy Briggs, owner of Rosie's Diner, issued a statement to a local reporter, affirming his long-standing commitment to the safety of his staff and patrons. The reporter noted that the statement had not been solicited. Michael read it on his phone in the garage and set the phone back in his pocket without comment. In the weeks that followed, the fraud investigation completed. 7 managers across the Whitmore restaurant subsidiary were terminated and referred for prosecution. Jessica implemented a comprehensive overhaul of labor reporting standards across every division of the company, established an anonymous employee reporting channel, and commissioned an independent audit of all subsidiary operations. She announced the changes publicly and without euphemism. The press called it a reckoning. She called it a correction. And when journalists asked what had prompted the decision to conduct the undercover review, she answered simply, she had wanted to understand something she could not understand from a distance. She came to the garage to make her proposal in person. She sat across from Michael at the small desk in the front office, the desk that still had Emma's crayon marks on one edge, and put the offer on the table plainly. Capital for the garage, expansion, equipment, a proper lease on a larger space, enough to make the numbers work in a way they never had. In exchange for nothing, she said. A gift. Then she stopped herself. Not a gift, she said. A correction. Michael looked at the desk. I don't want someone to hand me something, he said. I know. I spent 5 years putting money aside for this. I know exactly what I'd be giving up if I let someone else fund it. Independence, she said. Yes, she nodded. She had expected this. She had thought about it carefully, without assumptions, in the way she thought about most things that mattered. Then let me propose something different. A loan. Standard commercial terms. Market interest rate. I get nothing from it except back what I put in. He looked at her. Why would you do that? She was quiet for a moment. Because you did something that didn't cost you nothing, she said. It just looked like it did from the outside. It took him 3 more weeks to decide. He called her on a Tuesday night. After Emma was in bed, the house settled into its familiar quiet. I'll take the loan, he said, but I want a lawyer to look at the terms before I sign anything. Of course, she said. There was something in her voice that was not triumph. It was quieter than that. Do you have a lawyer? No. I'll find one, he said. A pause. Okay, she said. Okay. He sat for a while after they hung up, looking at the kitchen in the way you look at a room when something in it has changed without any of the furniture moving. The garage opened on a Wednesday in late February, in a larger space 3 blocks east of the old one. The sign above the door said Carter Auto, in clean letters with no flourishes. 5 bays, a proper waiting room, and a front desk wide enough to work at without crowding. Michael had hired 2 mechanics and a part-time office manager. The parts system was still the spreadsheet Jessica had built, because it was the best one he had and it would have been foolish pride to replace it. She came by that first week, on a Thursday afternoon, alone, no driver. She parked her own car at the curb and walked in wearing something more casual than the charcoal coat, her hair down. She stood in the waiting room and looked at the space with the quiet, careful attention she brought to most things. It looks good, she said. It does, he said. And it did. Emma came running from the back office where she had been doing homework. Thursdays were half days, and Michael always brought her in, and she threw her arms around Jessica's waist with the total conviction of a child who has decided something and will not be argued out of it. Jessica stood very still for a moment, her hands at her sides, and then she put her arms around Emma and held on. Michael watched them from the doorway between the waiting room and Bay One. He had a wrench in his hand and grease on his forearms, and the afternoon light was coming through the front windows at a low angle, doing something warm to the room. He didn't say anything. Some things don't require a word. A man who had spent 5 years carrying a quiet life without complaint, who had stood up in a diner because someone needed him to, who had built something real, with patient and ordinary labor. He was not a man for declarations. He had never needed to say the things he meant in order to mean them, but he understood, standing in the door of the garage he had finally built, watching his daughter hold on to a woman who had chosen, months ago in a parking lot in the cold, to say thank you instead of just walking away. He understood that some of the most significant things in a life announce themselves without any fanfare at all. The world does not always reward decency, but sometimes, in the ordinary course of an ordinary evening, decency and circumstance find each other in a diner on Clement Avenue, and something begins that neither person planned and both of them needed, and the rest works itself out one careful decision at a time. Michael put the wrench down on the workbench and went back to work.